Hi everybody, in this video I want to give a little overview of how to insert footnotes in Turabian style in Microsoft Word. And so what I'm going to do is I'm using a paper that I wrote a few years ago just as an example, and I'm going to sort of delete the footnotes that I have. I'm going to put some in so you see how it works. I do want to point out that the paper I'm showing you was for a course that had its own expectations. Every course has its own expectations. And so this is shorter than many history papers are because we wrote a bunch of essays in this course as well as other things that tended to be shorter rather than having one or two longer essays. So essentially what we do is when we use something from a source, we want to always cite it. You know that. So for example, um, footnote 9 on this paper ends with, as export agriculture has become less profitable, farm workers migrated. And then I have my footnote, and then at the bottom of my page we see where the footnote is, showing where I found that information. And of course, this is not a direct quote, but I still cite it. Now you also have to cite direct quotes. So for example here, I cited this direct quote. I cited this direct quote. You always have to cite direct quotes, but you also need to cite whenever you use information from a source. It is much better to cite a little too much than to not cite enough. Citations in Chicago format almost always will go at the end of a sentence. Sometimes they will go at the end of the paragraph. It just depends on what your professor wants. Now here, in this case, so let's look at these really briefly, and then I'll show you how to actually do it in Word. I have these three footnotes. They're all coming to this source, the Gamage source. And footnote 12 is telling my reader that's on pages 89 to 90. Footnote 13 is 92, and footnote 14 is 94 to 95. When you're using multiple pages from a source like this, it's better to have footnotes for specific pages than to just have one footnote at the end of the paragraph that lists page 89 to 95. You want your footnotes in general to be as specific as possible. They're designed to lead your reader to where the information is in the source. So it is best to do what I have done here and have multiple footnotes, each going to a specific page number. Now, it may be that your instructor wants something else and wants this final footnote only to say this is going to be the only footnote in the paragraph, and we're going to have it be from page 89 to 95. So if your professor wants that, then you would just have that footnote. Notice that Word is automatically renumbering the footnotes for me as I delete them. So let's say, though, I need a footnote here. How do I do it? Put your cursor where you want the footnote to be. The footnote will always come at the end of a sentence, never in the middle of a sentence, and it will always follow the period. Go to References and click Insert Footnote. Now, if you want to be really fancy the way Turabian wants it or Chicago wants it, you're going to go and you're going to tab over so you indent a footnote just like you would indent a paragraph. That is the correct way to do it according to Chicago or Turabian. And then the footnote itself, I'm going to make one up here. I'm going to make one up using a textbook for a class that I teach. So if this footnote came from an indigenous people's history of the United States, it doesn't, right? I'm making this footnote up. I would put the name of the author in regular order, a comma, the name of the book, and we would capitalize the names of the books in Turabian. I'm going to pause while I type. Names of books in Turabian are capitalized and they are italicized. And then after the name, in parentheses, we put the city of publication, the publisher's name, a comma, the date, and then again, the specific page number that the information comes from. Now here my footnote is too large. We normally want footnotes to be in 12-point font, or sorry, in 10-point font as opposed to the rest of the paper. And so I've just gone and I've changed the font down to 10 points. Notice that it's the same font as the rest of my paper. It's also in Times New Roman. So again, to review, to insert a footnote somewhere in your paper, click where you want it to go, click on the references tab at the top of your screen, and click on Insert Footnote. Tab over. You also want to put a line here. So footnotes themselves are not double spaced, they are single spaced, but we always want to have a line between each footnote. So if I am doing something from the same source, I'm going to use the word IBID. Now, some colleges don't require it, and so it's going to depend on where you go. But the colleges that I go to as a student do require it, or at least allow it. I find using IBID much easier. So if you're from the exact same source, just a different page number, I put IBID. If it's the exact same source and the exact same page, you just put IBID without the page number. So the page number changes, put IBID and follow it with the new page number. If the page number doesn't change, just put IBID. And then I want to draw your attention to one more thing, and that is that the word IBID is actually an abbreviation, and so it always has a period after it. So notice footnote 14, I have IBID, period, comma. A period always follows IBID because it's an abbreviation. It's an abbreviation of a longer Latin word. Now, if something comes between a source, like so here I'm using Dunbar Ortiz, but if instead this footnote came again from this Sarah Gamage article, then I would put the author's last name, a shortened version of the article title, and the page number. And then if this next source didn't come from that, like if this next source were from Dunbar Ortiz, then I would have to say that, right? Because IBID always means it's the exact same source as the source immediately in front of it. So if I'm going back and referring to a source a second time, I use a shortened version of the title. So for example, the Dunbar Ortiz book is called An Indigenous People's History of the United States. When I'm referring to it again, I just need to put 2 or 3 words from it. So Indigenous People's History. Similarly, this Gamage article, the original article is Exporting People and Recruiting Remittances, a Development Strategy for El Salvador, ? And then when I refer to it again, I just put Exporting People, a shortened version of the title. The first time I cite something, I need my full bibliographic information. When I cite it a second time, I just need the author's last name, a shortened version of the title, and the page number. The other thing you need is a bibliography, and it's called a bibliography in Chicago or Turabian at the end of the work. So the bibliography includes all sources that you cited. Now for this paper, I was actually required to use sources other than only books and journals. So I had to use online sources. That is not typical in history, and it's not typical in my classes. Obviously, if you do use an online source, you need to cite that source appropriately. And there's plenty of online resources to help you figure out how to do that. So I'm just going to add the bibliography entry here for the Dunbar Ortiz book. And so for a bibliography, we always start with the author's last name first. Notice that we use their full first name. This is different from APA format. In APA format, we use initials for the first name. But in Chicago or Turabian, we always use the full name. And so the title of the book, and then not in parentheses, the place of publication. So the place of publication, if it's published in the U.S., is going to be city, comma, state abbreviation, a 2-letter state abbreviation. You don't need a 2-letter state abbreviation if it's the only city by that name that people are going to recognize. So you don't need it for Chicago. You don't need it for Philadelphia. You don't need it for New York or Los Angeles. It's traditionally used for Boston because there is a Boston in England, I think, but it's probably okay if you don't put it there. Then the name of the publisher and the year of publication. So this is what the citation looks like for a book. For a journal article, it's very similar, except we also include the title of the journal in italics. We include the volume, not in italics, a comma, and then the specific abbreviation NO period, the number of the book that year, of the number of the journal that year. Then in parentheses, usually the month, always the year of the journal, a colon, and then we put the entire page range. Not just the pages that we used, but the entire page range of the article. The other thing you should do, if your journal isn't from a database, like if it's not from the databases of your college's library, you should end it with the URL. But notice down here for these YouTube videos that I cited, because I had to use YouTube for this essay that I wrote, I put the URL. So put the URL for things that you don't access specifically through your college's library databases. It's okay if you put it there too, but you definitely need to have something you just found online. Of course, remember, general online searches for most history papers are probably not good plans. You want to start with scholarly secondary sources or with quality primary sources. But make sure you give enough information for your reader to find where you found your information, and that includes a URL. However, a URL by itself is never, ever, ever an acceptable citation. So notice down here for my YouTube citations, I did not just include the URL. I gave the name of the creator or the creator organization. I gave the name of the video. I told my reader it's from YouTube. I told my reader the date that it was updated on YouTube. And then I ended with the URL. I hope you find this useful. If you have questions about Turabian, there are several sources that you can find. Your college's library almost certainly has resources available online about Turabian. Your college's librarians are almost certainly happy to help you as an online learner learn more about Turabian. Additionally, if you do an internet search for Chicago style or Turabian, they essentially mean the same thing today. They didn't used to, but they do today. You will find lots of useful resources, including from places like Purdue OWL that many college students have used for things like APA and MLA, also have resources for Chicago or Turabian. Please remember that in history, this is a little tricky. There's two types of Chicago. There's notes bibliography and there's author date. So there's two different Chicago formats, notes bibliography and author date. In history, unless your instructor tells you otherwise, we use notes bibliography. In other words, we use footnotes like I've used in my paper, and we have at the end a bibliography. This is typical in most history writing. Now, some colleges will have a different format. Always follow what your instructor says. So I hope you found this useful. If you're in one of my classes and you have questions about Turabian, please feel free to reach out. I am happy to help. Thanks for watching.